welcome back to The Empire Never Ended. Today it is me, Boris, and Rey.
Hey.
Fritz unfortunately can't make it today. He's literally getting the band back together for a wedding. It's it's like that sketch. What was this? Like SNL, the fist fight in the parking lot.
I don't know that one.
Except for like an indie band.
Oh.
Yeah. So here we are.
I think is this the first time we're doing it like this?
Yeah, I think so. I've missed an episode.
Yeah.
But Fritz has remained steadfast.
I don't know if I ever missed an episode. Maybe I did.
I don't think so. So, if you guys miss Fritz's beautiful voice, or just have enough of me and Rey talking, Fritz will be back for this week's premium episode.
Yes.
So, yeah. All right, let's jump into it.
Where are we now? We are kind of continuing where we stopped last time.
Yeah.
The topic is we're still kind of getting into our fourth arc. We didn't come to the main topic of it. This is a long introduction, I guess. So we're still talking about Slavic and specifically Yugoslav immigrants in the United States, right?
Yes, we are. And I guess last week we left off. We were talking about the lead up to World War II and the establishment of these broad anti-fascist coalitions among the South Slavic diaspora. And today we're going to jump right into the mess of what was going on with the South Slavs in World War II.
Okay.
It's an interesting topic. In some ways, it's kind of the moment in the sun for some of the leftist sections of the diaspora that we talked about, but that's all kind of short-lived. And kind of ironically, their participation in these big anti-fascist coalitions that supported the U.S. war effort would result in serious consequences in the McCarthy era, which we'll talk about a little bit more once we start digging into like the main part of this arc.
Yes. I mean, I guess in the beginning of this arc, we're kind of taking our time. We're talking about all of these like socialist, anarchist, communist, anti-fascist groups, Yugoslav groups in the United States, because I guess we're trying to make a point that it's not like everyone, because we are mostly focused on like right-wing terrorists. It's not like everyone was into that. There was like a large part of that history that was very opposed to those kind of things that we'll mostly talk about in the next episode. Yeah.
And I mean that, and it's definitely like an under-researched topic. So it would be a shame to leave it behind. So if, I mean, they even say this, like some of the guys that we're talking about when they wrote some of these accounts after World War II, they even say in like the 70s, they're like, hey, so nobody in Yugoslavia talks about what was happening in the U.S. during this time. So, it's kind of it's an interesting history. It's pretty forgotten. And I don't know, I think it's kind of important.
Sure. It also kind of sets the stage for what we will talk about in the future, especially now when we are talking about Second World War. I mean, we are getting really close to the heart of the topic of this arc. Yeah,
and some of the conflicts that will come up during World War II would be really important to the rest of this arc.
Yeah.
Like, for sure. And some of these characters and groups and all of that will be important. So let's go back to April 6th, 1941. Now, April 6th, 1941 is when the Axis powers invade Yugoslavia. We talk about that in Arc 2, so feel free to go back and listen to that. But in America, it on the one hand brought a new kind of unity among the various political tendencies of South Slavic immigrants, but predictably some of that didn't last so long. So, Mirko Markovic, the Comintern's man in America, who we talked a little bit about in last week, described the atmosphere in the immigrant community in Detroit in a kind of interesting way. So Markovic was in town for an already scheduled anti-fascist congress, which was coincidentally set to happen on the 6th. And he was staying at the house of a communist auto worker activist and was woken up to the news of the bombing of Belgrade. So him and a bunch of other communist activists huddled around the radio all day, listening to broadcasts that basically informed them that all communication with Yugoslavia has been severed, and they kind of didn't know what to do. because they knew that they had this Congress later on. They knew that people would have a whole lot of questions, and they had absolutely no answers for them. So they come into this Congress hall later that afternoon and find it absolutely full of people, including, as he said, many people who didn't regularly attend these kinds of events.
Sure.
Right? So naturally, everybody was concerned about the situation in the old country. They kind of start with a meeting. He gives some sort of speech, basically telling them that, the fascists have invaded, the worst has happened.
Yeah. And they're not only just invaded, they're invaded and they're like very mad and determined that Yugoslavia will not exist anymore.
Right, but they know literally nothing right now because this is day one of the invasion, right? So it's interesting to note that, the reason that they had an anti-fascist Congress scheduled for this day was that the preceding weeks, right, were important in Yugoslavia, right? The 27th of March, the overthrow of the pro-Axis government. So there was already a lot of discussion happening in the emigre communities about, the situation there. So like some of this, it was a surprise, but there was some expectation of it. And he recounts that after his speech, there was a kind of question and answer, at which point a member of the audience, who turned out to be a reserve officer in the Yugoslav Royal Army, assured the crowd that the army would prevail, that Yugoslavia was ready to defend itself against the invasion, that there was no chance that they would fall apart. And of course, that didn't happen, and the Royal Army collapsed in less than 2 weeks after the invasion, right? And the royal government flees to London, blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
Nevertheless, it's definitely true that the overwhelming attitude of the various emigre groups was to work together for the time being. So even the long-standing feud between the church and the Serbian National Federation and the American Serbian Defender, their newspaper, with the anti-fascist Vidovdan Congress and the newspaper The Free Word, were kind of attempted to be bridged. So, in the very early days, there were many meetings set up, and many of the church hierarchy even reluctantly attended some of these anti-fascist congresses. Markovic led a delegation to the fourth convocation of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Libertyville, Illinois, a place that will be pretty important later on. But, this...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This is not so unusual, just because, for example, as we mentioned many episodes ago, just before the invasion was supposedly provoked by anti-Axis demonstrations in Belgrade that happened on the 27th of March, and these were some of the organizers of these demonstrations were communists, but others were bishops, and even very conservative, you might even say fascist bishops, but who were nevertheless, for some reasons, anti-Axis. So it's not unusual that that there would be some kind of an alliance of that type, right, in this specific situation. Although
I think Bishop Dionysia, who had come into this position of bishop a year before, who was kind of an arch conservative protege of Velimirovic, and who would go on to lead his own schismatic church later on in the 60s, was quite surprised to see the communist delegation. He, I guess, even told them, "What in the devil brought you here?" He was not pleased.
By the way, maybe just to mention that Mirko Markovic that you're talking about and that we talked about in the last episode is possibly, we don't know, but he might be a character in a future TV show being prepared by David Simon.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, because David Simon for years is preparing a mini-series on Americans fighting in the Spanish Civil War, and specifically about the George Lincoln Battalion. And Mirko Markovic was one of the commanders of that battalion, as far as I know. So,
yeah, he was of the George Washington Battalion.
Ah, okay.
There was the other Yugoslav that was in charge of the Abraham Lincoln Battalion for a little bit.
Okay. Because I think that the show is called Lincolns in Spain or something like this. So we might actually see some of these guys that we were mentioning in that TV show when it finally is finished.
Yeah, which would be interesting because he's otherwise kind of been left to historical obscurity.
Yeah.
Unless, you follow either very specific things that happened in the Yugoslav emigre community or the Spanish Civil War, or the American brigades in the Spanish Civil War. So immediately after the capitulation of the Yugoslav government, the U.S. government authorized the Royal Government in Exile's official aid organization to Yugoslavia, but it was marred by problems from the very beginning, largely also because a lot of the immigrants no longer really trusted the royal government. So it was a pretty ineffective response, even on kind of a humanitarian level, to the invasion. So the cracks began to show in this flimsy coalition pretty early on. Following the Axis invasion of the USSR, Operation Barbarossa, in June of 1941, the Sixth Vidovdan Congress, which was, of course, the Serbian kind of Popular Front anti-fascist Congress, decided to, in lieu of being able to send any aid to Yugoslavia, raise money to purchase a full field hospital to be delivered to the Soviet Union via the Soviet mission in the U.S. And of course, this immediately provoked and upset the Serbian National Federation and the Serbian Defender newspaper, which, of course, proved to them that the Vidovdan Congress was nothing more than a communist front.
Yeah.
And there are even some reports, if you go on to read what was being said in the newspapers, that the nationalists threatened to intercept the trains carrying the supplies, that, they had workers in the railroad industry that knew when these trains would be coming, and that they threatened to sabotage the trains. There may have been even some physical altercations between pro and anti-Soviet Serbs. Nevertheless, they raised money for this field hospital, bought a field hospital, and donated about $3,000, which is about $60,000 in today's money, which was pretty significant and was the first donation of an American civilian group to the Soviet war effort, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But really, the major rift that would occur within the American Serbian community would happen later in the summer of 1941, when the first reports of the Ustaša genocide against Serbs began surfacing in America. So this information originally came in the form of a memorandum from a Serbian bishop, Valerian Stefanovic, who was in Serbia, who had wrote an appeal to the German commander in Yugoslavia to curb the slaughter of Serbs. Now, this document made its way from Serbia via the church and ended up in a sanitized version, which left out the appeal to the Germans, ended up going via the government in exile in England and the Anglican Church to reach the Serbian Orthodox Church in America.
Yeah, the Serbian Orthodox Church had a really good and close relationship with the Anglican Church.
Yeah, absolutely, which is also interesting. Now, at the time, it seemed that pretty much nobody in the American Yugoslav communities knew much about what was happening vis-a-vis, the Ustašas, or basically anything else in Yugoslavia. One thing that comes up constantly when you read any accounts of this time period is the lack of information that they had, right? Because they were relying on official news broadcasts and communiques by the government in exile, and they had pretty much no information that this was going on until the church released this document.
Yeah.
It is interesting, though, that the OSS did happen to know about a lot of this and was not reporting it. There have been some articles written about that, which is kind of an interesting topic maybe for a later discussion. Nevertheless, the impact that this information had a predictably polarizing effect on the Serbian American community and caused a major rift and distrust between, obviously, Serbian communities and Croatian communities, which up until this point had very little animosity. I mean, as we discussed in the last couple episodes, they tended to cooperate relatively well together. They didn't have very many problems, before this. So this was, became a major issue. So on the one hand, the Serbian National Federation, the church, and more nationalist elements of the government in exile finally had this proof that uniting with the Croats was a bad idea. They should have never done it. And of course, of this greater like Vatican and Catholic plot against the Serbs and the Orthodox people in general.
Yeah, which is pretty, unrealistic view of Serbian-Croatian relations, I think. Because as we kind of talked about in detail, the Ustaša regime that was doing these atrocities, which were horrible, was a very small movement that would never come to power in Croatia if there was no Nazi support for them.
Right, absolutely.
So it's not like they were representative of, larger Croatian politics of the time.
Right.
But unfortunately, they got their chance because, the Axis occupation of Yugoslavia.
Right, and don't tell the American Serbian Defender that,
Yeah.
because as the oldest and largest Serbian newspaper in America, they immediately got to work writing articles that were denouncing Croats as a whole, the Croatian nation as criminal, as to be kind of expected, right?
Yeah, because we also talked about this kind of anti-Croats Serbian politics that was developing in the 20s and 30s in Yugoslavia, which was not representative of the whole, Serbian politics of the time. For example, as we said, I think a few times now, Serbs in Croatia were really aligned with mainstream Croat politics of the time, with the Croatian Peasant Party, and were like the closest allies. So it was a complex situation, but for sure it's now that you're describing is kind of representative of this more kind of chauvinistic Serbian anti-Croat politics, I guess.
Right, and that was also represented in the U.S., as we mentioned last week. Most Serb immigrants at the time in the U.S. came from modern-day Croatia, and parties like the Independent Democrats had a large presence. They made up the kind of non-communist faction of the Vidovdan Congress.
Yes.
Right.
That's sort of the party that Nikola Tesla was even in some way aligned to.
Right. We'll get to Tesla in a little bit too. On the other hand, the communist newspaper Free Word and the Vidovdan Congress took it as their task then.
So the Vidovdan Congress is basically the anti-fascist Congress, kind of led by the communists, but also by the Independent Party of Serbs from Croatia and other factions, right?
Yeah,
it's a kind of a national front like type of organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And at this point in time, actually, members of the SNF and the church are sending delegations there, but like I said, rather reluctantly. And of course, after all this news comes out, that stops pretty quickly. The Free Word took it upon themselves to make a point to not talk about Croats in that way. I mean, keep in mind that they shared a building with the main Croatian communist newspaper, and of course, it didn't go in the favor of their politics to have a large percentage of the Serbian immigrant community suddenly become very anti-Croat. Yeah. So they did, of course, what the communists and the partisans did, and tended to always frame these groups as traitorous elements from the ranks of the people, as opposed to saying Croats in general, or Serbs in general. It's always phrased in pretty much everything that I've read, and this was true in the partisans too, of traitors, a minority of traitors from the ranks of, the Croatian people or whatever. And of course, part of that was also to imply that the disunity of Croats worked in favor of the Axis and both against the American war effort and the liberation movement of Yugoslavia. So I'm going to read a quick example of the kind of stuff that they were writing, because I think it's interesting. And some of it actually harkens back to the last arc, beginning of the last arc too. So here's an example from a text in the Free Word from 1941. In whose interest is it to divide the Serbs and Croats in the mines of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Ohio, or the Serbian and Croatian workers in the factories of Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Johnstown, Detroit, and Gary? It is in the interests of Hitler and the American First Committee. And now the American Serbian Defender has hitched themselves to the same wagon. Just as the other day in New York, America First shouted, "Death to President Roosevelt." Lindbergh shouted, "Down with the Jews." The American Serbian Defender, "Down with the Croats." The independent state of Croatia, "Down with the Serbs." And the KKK, "Down with the blacks." These slogans and sentiments spread throughout all national groups, faiths, and races. And that is exactly what Hitler wants. That is the victory of fascism.
Interesting.
And then here's just another quick one. Uniting Serbian Americans and Croatian Americans means to help the liberation fighters of Yugoslavia in the American war effort. Uniting American Serbs and Croats and other Slavs around the All-Slav Congress means to help the Slavs defeat Hitler.
Interesting. Also, we should just keep in mind what we mentioned last time, and this is how Mirko Markovic and the other communist cadre kind of... Now they're talking about how it's necessary for Croats and Serbs to unite, but before that they were really pushing them to have separate organizations, although they preferred to have like common Yugoslav or groups.
Yeah, and we'll talk about like how they end up coming back together. I mean, I don't know, in one of Markovic's accounts from, way later, he says that he made mistakes while he was organizing in America, but he doesn't really say specifically which ones. And I wonder if that's it, because I mean, like, as we'll see in this episode, it took a little bit of time to once again get a united front because they had spent all this time separating all these groups and now wanted them to come back together. So it was pretty difficult. Another kind of interesting example of how this polarization played out can be seen in the churches themselves, right? So last week we mentioned this guy, Strahinja Maletic, who was kind of one of these more outspoken Marxist priests. Who led a congregation in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, which, by his account, became split at this time period between people who were in favor of a union with Croats and this kind of growing nationalist section. And this, cost him his position in the church, too. So, I mean, he refused to, denounce Croats during his sermons and lent his outward support for the free word, and that led Bishop Dionisia to denounce him in the American Serb Defender, and would eventually lead to his outright excommunication from the church in 1944. So, I mean, he was straight up kicked out.
Yeah. Well, being a pro-Croat communist priest is not like, and you have a bishop who's basically like a right-winger, to say the least, is something like that will happen to you.
Right. I mean, he would then go on to become an instrumental part of the United Committee of South Slavic Americans and the American Slav Congress, which I guess we'll have a full episode about on Friday. But I mean, it is worth mentioning that, like, again, none of these people had very much information about what was going on. And ultimately, a large number of the people that we're talking about were affected by the war and Ustaša genocide in some way or another. So, I mean, even the two guys that we just mentioned, like Mirko Markovic, his mother was executed by the fascists. Strahinja Maletic lost all three of his brothers, who were all fighters in the partisans and the like. And this is undoubtedly true for, almost everybody in these congregations as well. They just literally had no information about it. So there was this really tense and frenzied environment that was going on at the time, which, to some degree is understandable. But, these people were literally, duking it out because of it, and it was a completely new phenomenon in this community, right? Because the voices that had previously been kind of more extreme anti-Croat, anti-Catholic were very marginal and were, pretty unimportant. But this radicalization was furthered in a large part by the establishment of the Serbian National Defense, which happened shortly thereafter in 1941.
Well, this is now... Okay, maybe this is... Because I know that Serbian National Defense was established in America in 1914.
No, well, that's the original one. So this is the second incarnation of it.
Okay, I guess it had many incarnations because
then there was
National
one in the 60s,
Defense was originally founded in 1908 in Serbia. So it's, I guess, a kind of a shape-shifting group. Yeah,
I think the one that was founded around World War I had disbanded. But it was founded again in 1941, in large part by the figure of Jovan Dučić. Do you know anything about Dučić?
Yeah, I mean, he's a very celebrated Serbian poet who was a diplomat, but who was like a hardcore Serbian nationalist.
Right. But where was he a diplomat too? And that's kind of important for how, especially these communists see him. He, at the start of World War II, had been the Yugoslav ambassador to Franco's Spain.
Oh, okay.
And many had said that he was, sympathetic to Franco. The Free Word immediately called him a phalangist, and called his, the Serbian National Defense a phalangist group. But, he had to actually leave Spain because Spain recognized the independent state of Croatia, the Nazi Croatian puppet state. So, he had to leave Spain. He, via Portugal, ended up in the U.S. As he had some relatives in Gary, Indiana.
Okay. So Wikipedia says that Serbian National Defense was founded by Mihailo Pupin in 1914 in New York.
Yeah.
And then in 1941, the headquarters were relocated to Chicago under the leadership of Mihailo Dučić. But its influence waned, and then it was revived by his brother Jovan Dučić that we are talking about. So the Wikipedia portrays this as a kind of revival of the original organization that supposedly existed the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, the Serbian National Defense website is somewhat similar too. I mean, they heavily emphasize Dučić. I mean, they talk about the previous period. And ironically, it's one of the only places on the internet where you can read anything about the conflict between like the Free Word and the United Committee of American South Slavs, because, they still have that up on their website. They're still like on that shit. They're still mad about it.
Yeah.
The organization, it still exists. You know what I mean? But I mean, they had a much, much, much more radical stance, right? They advocated for complete disunity with Croats, and really propagated this traditional kind of Greater Serbia idea as we know it, and advocated for some kind of orthodox clero-fascist union between Serbia, Greece, and Romania, which, at the time, Romania is ruled by, Orthodox clero-fascists and Codreanu and the like. So, I mean, clearly there seem to be some sympathies there. But they notably exclude Bulgaria and I think Dučić said this himself, or at least Maletić quotes him as saying it, because the people in Bulgaria are too communist-oriented.
Okay.
But I think that's, again, maybe just the Serbian-Bulgarian rivalry that, has its own history.
Yeah, I mean, the Communist Party in Bulgaria was not huge, I think. It was pretty small.
But don't tell them that. They're a bunch of commies. They're not real Orthodox people. And of course, they denounce any kind of unity with Croats and Slovaks. They don't like the Slovaks either. But yes, Greece and Romania are okay.
Maybe because they just follow official politics. And so Slovakia, it was a pro-Axis puppet state at the time that recognized independent state of Croatia. So maybe they're just guided by that. Yeah.
And again, like I mentioned, some kind of important figures in this strong anti-Croat stance is, of course, the bishop of the church, Dionysie. Somebody that I mentioned last week briefly, the royal government's delegate to the United States, Konstantin Fotić, who in 1942 would become the official ambassador. He's also largely quoted as being, kind of rabidly anti-Croat in this time period. And to the extent that, I was reading FBI and OSS records about these people, and they have a pretty clear-headed analysis, and they're like, yeah, Fotić, and they're like, Dučić is really extreme. He's an extremist. But of course, the difference between something like Serbian National Defense and the Croats that I'm about to talk to is that, ostensibly the Serbs were on the Allies no matter what, right? So even if these guys were propagating some sort of quasi-fascist politics, it didn't particularly matter because they're on our side, right? Of course, Serbian National Defense will say that it's anti-Nazi, it's anti-fascist, blah, 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 blah. But, they're pretty straight. They're pretty forward with their politics, much more so than the Serbian National Federation, which, decided to pursue what they called parallel politics with from the Free Word and the Vidovdan Congress, in which they, especially in these early days, agreed, okay, we're both against Hitler. We both want Hitler out, but that is kind of where our similarities end. Yeah. And so they both then support the American effort, the Allies, or whatever, but, we'll only really work together if they have to.
Yeah. I mean, Serbian National Defense is a very important group for this arc, I think.
Absolutely.
And it has many different incarnations, and it's a kind of a very shadowy organization. Like even talking about its kind of parent group, which was the original national defense organized in Serbia in 1908. I mean, that group had like close ties with the secret group called the Black Hand, that a lot of people know about, who were, closely, was a part of the organization of the assassination of Ferdinand, who, it was like a secret group of Serbian army officers. That probably did continue to exist for some time in the later decades. And then the Serbian national defense in America was also in Europe in, post Second World War period, was also close to groups that kind of adopted the Black Hand as a model for organizing that we'll talk about later on.
Yeah, because they're later on linked explicitly with these kind of terrorist, like nationalist movements and figures and the like. And, you can tell from 1941 on that they're, kind of the most extreme out of this faction.
Yeah. And later on, there are even ties with organized crime and so on. So it's like a very complicated and long history.
Yeah. They're one of the most prominently represented groups in this arc, for sure.
Yeah.
So what was happening then with Croatian Americans? So as we mentioned last week, there had been major struggles within the Croatian community to establish a broader anti-fascist coalition. So something like the Vidovdan Congress didn't really emerge in the Croatian community, but there were significant struggles within their fraternal organizations and within their kind of apolitical groups. And of course, this, I'm not including here their the communist faction that was centered around the Workers' Herald, that, shared offices with the Free Word.
Yeah.
This would change pretty quickly following the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia, and especially after America's entry into the war, after Pearl Harbor, because the Ustašas were, of course, given a puppet state, and the independent state of Croatia, which was now part of the Axis powers and later would, be at war with the United States. As a result, there was tremendous pressure both from the U.S. state and from within the Croatian American community to come out on the side of the Allied effort. So, I mean, this is kind of like in our last arc when we talked about what happened to the Italian fascists in America, or, kind of like what happened to the German-American Bund too, right? Once the war starts, these emigre groups become actual enemies. Last week we mentioned that the Ustašas themselves had established a presence in America in the late 1930s through direct Ustaša agents Ante Došin and Luka Grbić, and through the newspapers The Croatian Home Defender and The Independent State of Croatia. By early 1942, the FBI raided the offices of the Croatian Home Defender and opened official inquiries into the activities of pro-Pavelić Croats in the U.S. So I guess even before 1942, the Justice Department had tried to shut down the Home Defender. It wasn't really until America had entered the war and, they became officially at war with the independent state of Croatia that the FBI actually started raiding them. But interestingly, they detained guys like Došin, but they never really managed to arrest them or charge them with anything. It's interesting to me because Došin would later continue his Ustaša activities in the U.S. after the war.
Okay.
Nevertheless, the FBI and OSI launched investigations into a lot of these different Croatian groups that they thought were more radical, specifically the Croatian Catholic Union and lots of members of the Catholic clergy who remained in support of Croatian independence. And there's some interesting accounts here, both from the OSS officers about these guys and what some of these clergymen were saying themselves in some of these new newspapers that were emerging that were still in support of Croatian independence. So, with all the pressure put on them to, be allies, there were still Catholic priests who were saying stuff like, okay, we support the effort of our new homeland, but we can't denounce our own homeland. At least Pavelić freed Croatia from the Serbs and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So these inquiries existed. They didn't really, this wasn't like Japanese internment camps for Croats or something like that. These guys weren't really getting arrested, but they were being monitored, pretty heavily. And of course, the the real like pro Pavelic, like the Croatian Home Defender newspapers weren't allowed to start up until after the war, which they did, but during the war they were kept under wraps.
However, after the war they were part of a new anti-communist coalition, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And these guys would resurface again after that.
Yeah.
But, you know, the vast majority of Croatian Americans and their political organizations and social organizations were, of course, never really aligned with the Ustaša message. I mean, we talked about in the previous 2 episodes that the Croatian immigrant community specifically was largely left-oriented for most of its existence. Even the ones that weren't particularly left-oriented were not, you know, Ustašas and, you know, virulently anti-Serb or whatever.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there were, you know, Croatian pro-independence or some degree of autonomy politicians and figures that were living in the U.S. at the time that had fled the monarchy. Needless to say, vast majority of them weren't fascists. And a large number of Croatian immigrant organizations would be represented in these kind of anti-fascist coalitions that would emerge later in the war.
Well, yeah, like the members of the Croatian Peasant Party went to fight in Spain on the anti-fascist side. Like
right.
A large number of them. So
right. And kind of as a symbol of this, you know, popular frontism, the communist newspaper, the Croatian communist newspaper, changed its name from the Workers' Herald to the People's Herald. Not surprisingly, right?
Yes.
To have a broader appeal. And they ramped up their production, right? So they become actually a daily newspaper for like the rest of the war. Whereas previously, I think they were publishing weekly. All of this gets a little bit more complicated now because of the relationship of the Allies with the Chetniks and Draža Mihailović. Now, at the beginning of the war, when the war started, we talked about this a little bit in the past, even like in Arc 2, there was kind of an American love affair with the Chetniks.
Yeah, we talked about the movies.
Yeah, right. We talked about, you know, Chetniks, the fighting guerrillas of Yugoslavia or whatever, which comes out in 1943, which is even a little bit late for that, you know, love affair.
Yeah, but that's the time where they were already basically ready to dump the Chetniks and go for the partisans. Yeah.
Right, but American media wrote very favorably about him and about the Chetniks. They became this kind of mythologized like resistance symbol in occupied Europe, right? You know, the Draža Mihailović, he's, you know, featured on the cover of Time magazine in 1942.
Yeah.
You know, the New York Times constantly writing all these lovely, lovely stories about him.
In the meantime, this guy's heavily like collaborating with the occupiers.
Right. But in the communist media, it's interesting to read about it from this time because, you know, they also initially supported Mihailović and the Chetniks.
They did, yeah.
Yeah, and
in 1941, the partisans and Chetniks were allies.
Right. Although, you know, by their account, this cooperation continued longer in the diaspora because they hadn't yet received word of Chetnik collaborations with various Axis powers. So you get these interesting situations in which, you know, the CPUSA, the Communist Party of America, and the British Communist Party are printing, you know, flyers with Draža Mihailović's face on it, pins and that kind of thing. And this actually comes much to the chagrin of some of these Yugoslav communists pretty soon thereafter, because already by late 1941, early 1942 is when they start getting information about collaboration. So in the Free Word, they say that they got a memorandum written by partisans from Sanjak, so this area, the border between Serbia and Montenegro.
Which has a large, like, Muslim population.
Yeah. Detailing, like, the atrocities and collaboration of the Chetniks in that area. And this is, according to at least the communist press, the first they had ever heard of this, right? Yeah. And they knew, they did know about the partisans, but they didn't have a direct communications line, or at least they say they didn't. We do know that like Marković was reporting pretty regularly to like Soviet representatives in the U.S. How much they knew is not quite certain, but this is definitely where they start to make kind of a more overt turn against the Chetniks.
Yeah, and also it's interesting because, if he was like directly kind of reporting to the Soviets, the Yugoslav Communist Party was at the time closely allied to the Soviet Union, but was not always doing things that were 100% approved by the Soviet Union. So, right. Because, it was a complicated situation in occupied Yugoslavia, so they had to, improvise.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it is altogether possible that they didn't know much until this time period. Of course, this starts to change because they get connections to Radio Free Yugoslavia, which was kind of the Yugoslav partisans' official radio voice that was based in the Soviet Union at the time, in the Caucasus, I think in like Tbilisi or something like that in Georgia. Mm-hmm. So they cite, like, once we started to get, information from Radio Free Yugoslavia, and that's when we started to hear more about collaboration and learn more about the partisans.
Yeah. Just quickly to come back to what was just said, like from what I remember, the Soviet Union was like really much more firmly pro-Chetnik for a longer time than the Yugoslav communists were, and were kind of insisting on the partisan being aligned with the Chetniks, and even letting, Draža lead the resistance and such things. So there was like various, explanations why was that so. Some were like very probably kind of stupid ideological ones, but then there were others that really, the Comintern had its agents, in Chetnik headquarters, like in the top of the movement and so on, which, there is some support for that, but maybe it's just made up.
Yeah. Well, you can see that there's even kind of a rift like emerging between like the Yugoslav communists in the American Communist Party and the rest of the American Communist Party. The rest of the American Communist Party kind of continues to support the Chetniks until the American government officially changes their stance.
Yeah, well, they were following the Stalin line, probably, in that.
Right. But interestingly, the Yugoslav communists weren't. So they immediately were writing articles called, Who is Draža Mihailović? Trying to,
yeah. Well, that's the difference between, ideology and reality, because, like, if you are a Yugoslav partisan, you're seeing these assholes collaborating not only with Germans, but also, like, with Ustašas in some regions, and, just committing genocide in Sanjak, where you mentioned, like, just, completely annihilating whole villages of Muslims and so on. And then you have, directions from Moscow saying how this is an anti-fascist resistance group or something like this.
Right. And I definitely read like some annoyed kind of statements about being like, yeah, these, fucking Americans are still into Draža.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the correct scientific line.
It even got to the point that, Marković got called in by the U.S. government to tell him to stop writing, these articles about Mihailović because, that's a representative of the official Yugoslav government. Like you can't be writing that. And when he writes that, he writes it in scare quotes.
Yes, because
officially representative.
Yugoslavia had a government in exile, a monarchist one, and they recognized Draža Mihailović as the leader of the Serbian, the Yugoslav army in fatherland, and he was even appointed a government, like a place in government. He was a minister in the government. So yeah, for that reason, he was officially like a official Yugoslav representative until the Allies changed their minds.
Right, and to Bishop Dionisia and the church and the American Srbobran, this was all bullshit. I think Dionisia was quoted of saying himself that you can't trust this information coming from Sanjak because Montenegro was a hotbed for communism before the war. So, it's all commie propaganda. Don't listen to that.
Yeah.
But there definitely did start to be a turnaround. And this is kind of where you start to see a really major success of this popular front politics in the immigrant communities with the establishment of the United Committee of South Slavic Americans. Now, I'm completely neglecting the American Slav Congress because we're going to cover that separately.
Okay.
And it kind of does intersect with this, but, for our free listeners, you can get a little taste now. So what's interesting to me, at least, about the United Committee of South Slavic Americans is that it's the kind of quintessential successful popular front in that it not only united different political factions, but also was like an interesting case of cross-class collaboration in a way that really angered some of the more kind of left-wing elements. And this kind of starts in the fall of 1942. And in the fall of 1942, you have the 7th Vidovdan Congress, which was a pretty important one for them because it's, already when the war is on, they already kind of know what's going on with Mihailovich, and they're now faced with the problems within the Serbian community. It's probably their most important Congress that they have. And it's, this one's held in Detroit again, had some approval by even some U.S. congressmen, and of course was also the one where Nikola Tesla voiced his approval and support for the Vidovdan Congress. And this is just like about a year before Tesla dies, because he dies in 43. So just real quick about that, that's a little aside. Nikola Tesla, as the most famous and prominent Yugoslav American, Serbian American, they found it very important to try to get his support, right? Because right now, what they're concerned with the most is trying to win the support of the American public / U.S. government. Because the U.S. government's still supporting the monarchy. They still have, guys like Fotic, who's an ambassador, who's, kind of whipping up this nationalist sentiment. And they managed to do that. So, Markovic even writes that he visited Tesla himself in New York and started reading to him like some of the statements of the Serbian national defense, which I guess really pissed Tesla off. And so, he was like, look, can you voice your support for the Vidovdan Congress? And he says, yes, of course, I voice my support for, any organization that works for the unity of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes.
Yeah.
He's also probably influenced here by his nephew, Sava Kosanovic, who becomes a major figure in the United Committee of South Slavic Americans. Real quick, just about him, I mean, he's a guy who was a minister in the royal government, who ends up in America when the war starts, but was also a member of the Independent Democratic Party, right?
Yeah, which is the party of Serbs from Croatia, which was the ally of the Croatian Peasant Party, a close ally of them. And kind of together, the Serbs of Croatia and the Croatian Peasant Party were kind of an autonomist movement, often opposed to the centralist government in Belgrade. So, which is like a interesting part of history that's often overlooked both by Serbian and Croatian nationalists.
Right. And Kosanovic is kind of unique in being a former royalist minister who then comes out completely in favor of the partisans. And he does this, while he's in America. So he comes to America when the war starts and is this kind of both a bridge between like the official Yugoslav government for a while and, Tesla in the US. He occupies this kind of prestigious position, and like a privileged position in that sense, but then, turns his back on the rest of the royal government in exile and comes out in favor of the partisans and the anti-fascist Council for the Liberation of Yugoslavia. So at the 7th Vidovdan Congress, they decide that there is a need to form a united committee, and that they can form a united committee after each group forms its own anti-fascist coalition.
Of course, because that's Leninist, and now Stalinist ideology. Yeah.
Right. So, at this meeting, they appoint this guy who I briefly mentioned last week, Jovan Krajinovic, who's a priest, as the chairman of the new Vidovdan Congress, which, he's going to lead into this formation of this united committee. He dies a year later, and that gets taken up by somebody else. But they make it a point specifically to put a lot of these dissident clergy members in positions of power within the Serbian anti-fascist organizations to counter the narrative that the church is, against Yugoslavia or whatever. And they even write about this in the Free Word. They say, the nationalists say that, we're against the church, but look how many priests we have, right?
Yeah, I think we mentioned before there was this division that many ordinary priests in the Serbian church were, sympathetic to the Communist Party, the workers' movement, socialists, even from the 19th century, and had a large participation in the partisan movement. But on the other hand, the bishops, like the people with power in the church, were very right-wing and even fascist.
Right. So the first group to follow the call of the Vidovdan Congress were the Slovenes and the major Slovene organizations, which soon thereafter formed their own large anti-fascist committee. They met in Cleveland in 1942. It was about 500 or so delegates appointed one of their old and respected socialist leaders to be the chairman of the group. They had a pretty influential newspaper called Equality, which then officially, sends out the call to join, to support the Anti-Fascist Congress. And they appoint Luis Adamic as the honorary leader. And so we can do a real quick aside about who Luis Adamic is.
Yeah.
So Luis Adamic is an incredibly important figure both in this United Committee and then also in the American Slav Congress. He was kind of one of the more well-known and well-respected members of the, Yugoslav American diaspora. He was Slovene originally, immigrated to the U.S. when he was 15, and was a relatively well-known writer in the U.S. His book, The Native's Return, came out, I think, in the 30s, and it was about him, revisiting royalist Yugoslavia, and, he had kind of leftist inclinations, and so he describes the political situation there, how fucked up it is. And it was a bestseller in the U.S. For that period of time. It was one of the only books that Americans had read about Yugoslavia. So at this point he is a pretty well respected figure, and that's why he's honorary leader, and that's why he goes on to take up leadership positions in the American Slav Congress as well. He also wrote kind of cool books like Dynamite, which is a history of American class violence. Interesting figure, in the OSS reports about him that I read from this time period, they say stuff about him being, important, and he's leftist but not extreme. And then in a classic American formulation, they say his individualism will probably not allow him to invest himself too heavily in groups. Which turned out not to be true. I think this was from the OSS report, in 1941, before the formation of the United Committee. Adamic we'll talk a lot about in our premium episode this week, but
he was a kind of interesting guy. Not completely in a way, the OSS was right that he was not completely aligned with some specific ideology. He was kind of generally socialist, I guess.
Yeah,
I think he had in the book Dynamite, you can see he has sympathies for the Wobblies, I would say.
Yeah.
But he was not an anarchist at all, I think. And then in this period, he was very, very, pro-Yugoslav partisans.
Right. And that's kind of representative of how a lot of the Slovene community was at the time, which was kind of more broadly socialist, like this newspaper Equality and the guy that they appointed as the actual chairman. So the Croats followed a little bit later, but had a much bigger Congress. So they were already kind of in early 1943 meeting. They formed this Congress with over 1,000 delegates who appoint as a chairperson another really interesting figure and another really important guy in the American Slav Congress and the United Committee of Zlatko Balokovic. Do you know who this guy is?
No.
Have you ever heard of him?
No, I don't think so.
Pretty crazy story. Interesting story. So, he was a well-respected Croatian violinist and musician. that married into one of the like ruling American families. So he married Joyce Borden, who was this like heiress to this massive Borden fortune, and like Markovic describes her as part of the original like Mayflower wasps.
Yeah.
So like her nephew was Adlai Stevenson, who was later governor of Illinois. Through her connections to like the American political establishment, members of the United Committee had direct audience with Eleanor Roosevelt. And like she pulled a lot of strings for the United Committee, which again is why I'm saying it's kind of this interesting kind of class collaboration. Although Bolokovic himself was very much kind of leftist inclined, especially after the war. He went to Yugoslavia, and
this was like I'm definitely not even close to any kind of an expert on American political history, but I would say that this, period, FDR, and anti-fascism in America is maybe the period when American kind of political culture was the most left-wing ever. Like that you had, members of the establishment with such sympathies, and even, the OSS working with communists,
right,
and things like that. So
it should be noted though, like not everyone in the political establishment in the U.S. was crazy about this.
Yeah.
Referring to Adamic specifically, I think it was a congressman from Illinois called him, the biggest threat to America. Part of kind of one of the reasons why the OSS did work with communists, and you see this in some of their letters, is that they became concerned that the fragmentation of like the working class specifically of Yugoslav origin in America would hamper the war effort, because so many Yugoslavs and Slavs in general were living and working in the heartland of American industry. Like all of American steel was being produced in these areas where most of their communities were. So, I mean, they had like a strategic imperative for kind of maintaining some sort of unity, right?
Yeah.
And they talk about that pretty explicitly too. And like, they're very concerned with this. But yeah, definitely. I mean, like, when else are you going to have, like this kind of string pulling, it's like, like what luck that they had somebody that was like deep embedded in like the American like blue blood oligarchy that was just also like the heiress to like billionaire's fortune or whatever,
or that you would have like some support of some Congress, like members of Congress for like the conference organized by Yugoslav communists, basically, things like that.
Right. So following the Croatian Congress, they have their first gathering, which is in Pittsburgh in the summer of 1943. But the first official meeting, in this like unofficial meeting, is when they kind of lay out the groundwork for what they're going to do, who's going to be in what position, whatever. But they don't announce it publicly because the Macedonians and Bulgarians still haven't finished their conferences. So they kind of have to wait for them and then have their first official meeting in Cleveland that August, so like like a month or so later. And so they appoint Louis Adamic and Zlatko Bolokovic as the presidents. Obviously, this makes sense. They're the kind of most prestigious, well-known Yugoslav Americans at this time.
So in America, Bulgarians are Yugoslavs. Interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I don't really have a ton of time to go into what was going on with the Macedonians at the time, but there was a lot of conflict happening in the Macedonian community in the 30s and 40s as well, because basically there was an American branch of VMRO that we discussed in one of our last episodes of the second season.
A whole episode on them. Crazy group.
That were trying to Bulgarianize the Macedonians. So the Macedonian representative to the United Committee, one of them at least, there's actually quite a few of them, is a Macedonian priest who, much like what was going on in the Serbian church at the time, refused to join the official Bulgarian diocese when they opened their official diocese in the U.S. So I think he was from Steelton, Pennsylvania, or something like that, Markov. And just like an interesting aside about Macedonians too. At one of the early congresses, when the church members were still attending, Bishop Dionysia is sitting there and talking to one of the guys next to him. He says, "I just hope to God they don't bring a representative of this Macedonian nation. Like how can they have a speaker from the Macedonian nation when that nation doesn't exist?" And of course, he's talking to this guy Pirinsky, who's a Macedonian, and who says, "Well, I'm a Macedonian. I'm part of this delegation." so I mean, they have it. They're fucked, you know.
And does he tell him then? But how? But you don't exist. Like, how is it possible?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. They say that he like waved him off.
Yeah.
So you know, the Macedonians are then like having to deal with, you know, both the Bulgarian church and the Serbian church not recognizing them. They of course are pretty enthusiastic to join this because, you know, they're getting recognized as not Bulgarians or Serbs.
Yeah. An issue that's still going on.
An issue that's still going on, yeah, right now. Yeah, Bulgaria wants to block any kind of EU accession for Macedonia until they
admit they are Bulgarians. You know?
Fuck me.
It's a pretty crazy policy.
Yeah. And it really goes back like over like 100 years. So yeah, of course they're delegates from all of these communities. That priest Maletic becomes secretary. You know, he said initially they had to keep it in secret because he hadn't worked out his problem with the diocese. And then he writes kind of sarcastically, "And then I did," which means that that's when they excommunicated him. Kind of funny. But they develop a 5-point plan that I'll just run through really quickly. And that is develop a united anti-fascist front of South Slavic Americans to give full support to the Allied war effort. Give moral, political, and material support to the Anti-Fascist Council for National Liberation of Yugoslavia and the partisans. 3, demand that the Allies formally recognize the Anti-Fascist Council for National Liberation of Yugoslavia. 4, demand the inclusion of all occupied territories into a new Yugoslav Federation, everything that was pre-World War II borders of Yugoslavia, so everything occupied currently by Italy, Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And then 5, develop a plan for South Slavic Americans to help renew and rebuild their countries after the war. So that was their 5-point plan. They also developed a very robust system of propagandizing and got to work immediately doing so. And they did that in kind of interesting ways. They describe like their organization as going through quote unquote key men in every city that would, you know, work to agitate for the cause through distribute leaflets and books, through labor unions, through, you know, whatever connections you could make. And they established this news bulletin that, you know, that was going out regularly and kind of propagandizing the partisan cause. Louis Adamic was the editor of that and was responsible for most of what was being written there. And I mean, Maletic himself says, when you're working in America, you have to appeal to American sensibilities. And so, you know, when you read the bulletin, it takes the partisan slogan, "Death to Fascism, Freedom to the People." But since it says liberty to the people, it's slightly more American. You know, maybe I'll post one of their posters, but, you know, everything is talking about like the democratic efforts of the Yugoslav people to establish a democratic federation, this, that, and the other thing. Of course, every time that they are denounced as communist, because, I mean, a majority of the leadership was, but, you know, they would go back and say, well, no, look at the connections that we have. Yeah. Because interestingly, they developed some relationships with some Yugoslav American industrialists. Okay. And their representative for South America was a Croatian Chilean like ship owner, capitalist, straight up. Who later would have problems a little later down the line with them. But, you know, they would say, well, you know, if we were just communists, how would we have, this money-grubbing capitalist over here? And, look at the representatives of industry and the church and this, that, the other thing.
Yeah, which also shows you how, things are more complicated than people usually think. Now, a lot of people who, think they know about Yugoslav politics, when they hear Second World War, Croatian capitalist in Chile, 100% is like some Ustaša guy.
Yeah.
But this one is an ally of the communists.
Yeah. And you see, there's a lot of unexpected twists and turns there with some of their supporters. Mm-hmm. That, of course, didn't represent everybody, but lo and behold, they would get a lot of their wishes come true pretty quickly, right? So just, I'm racing through this a little bit, but, following the Tehran conference, when the Allies officially, decide, when the Americans actually finally decide to support the partisans.
When was this?
43. That's when they start getting a lot more, support, conventional support from, in recognition from the U.S. government. So like I said, through a lot of Balakovic's wife's connections, they had audiences with, everybody, including FDR. They put Eleanor Roosevelt becomes head of the American Committee for Yugoslav Relief. And the American Committee for Yugoslav Relief is actually really important here because, as I mentioned really early on in this episode, immediately after the war started, there was an American Committee of Relief or whatever, some aid organization founded by the monarchy, but that really didn't work at all. Throughout the war, until basically this time period, the U.S. government hadn't recognized any of the other immigrant groups' efforts to have a recognized group to send any kind of aid to Yugoslavia, which was very important for them because they couldn't do that. They couldn't do anything otherwise, right? You couldn't gather support because it's not like, they could just charter a boat and go there. Everything had to go through, obviously, the U.S. military, the U.S. government. So that's a pretty big turning point for them. Mm-hmm. At this point, by the late 40s, it's already clear that, the partisans are going to win. They have the support of the U.S. government at this point. The American, Yugoslav Relief Committee is gathering millions of dollars in throughout the U.S., particularly, in some cases, they talk about Los Angeles, the Croatian community in Los Angeles was gathering huge amounts of money. Some of them wielded a lot of influence. Really a lot of shit you don't hear about anymore, but it finally was kind of going back to the 1920s in terms of having a unified, Yugoslav organization.
That's it's kind of funny because, it's not like when I make fun of this kind of communist policy of separating, these people into Serbs, Croats, Slovenians, and so on. I'm not saying this from a position of, some kind of a Yugoslav nationalist who's saying that something like a Yugoslav nation exists. I'm just saying that, it's kind of, this shows how it's ridiculous to look these things through this kind of nationalist ideology that the communists at the time were insisting on, and kind of made the whole second Yugoslavia was made on kind of this basis, which is also very connected to its dissolution in the 90s. Because these people were kind of doing things together, and it was very natural for them to do things together because they were culturally close to each other, they spoke the same language, they had the same references and so on. So it's not even that they were necessarily some kind of Yugoslav nationalists, but it was just a kind of a natural thing for them to do. And then you have these communist ideologues sent by the Comintern who come there and force them to separate in different groups based on their ideology that is propagating this, because basically they're saying that this is they think that it is not only a necessary thing to do in terms of, historical progress, that nations should be formed, but they think that this is somehow that the people want that, And so they are going to the people and saying to them, you need to do this, but people are resisting that. But the basis of why they're saying you need to do this is that they actually want that. That it's somehow, this is how the communist movement will get closer to the people by supporting their national liberation movements, even when the people are actually not interested in such a movement.
Right. And like we said, there's the absurdity of the majority of the CPUSA continuing to support Mihailović, even though all the Yugoslavs who made up a considerable portion of the party were like, no. I mean, actually, even the Serbian National Defense mentions that. They're like, well, these fanatics, like even the American communists knew that Draža was the real leader or whatever. Which is, levels of absurd.
Yes.
Of course, Tito in 1944 sends a letter directly to Luis Adamić to congratulate the United Committee of South Slavic Americans and to voice his support and his thanks for the aid that they're sending. Later on, the American Committee of Yugoslav Relief was awarded the Order of Brotherhood and Unity First Class by Tito after the war.
Oh, okay.
So I guess, we can fast forward real quick then to the end of the war. There are some important things here too. We'll talk about more in the American Slav Congress, like the Yugoslav Sailors Union that was based in New York, that was kind of instrumental in delivering aid, and also at the end of the war, the Yugoslav government purchased 2 cargo ships to facilitate the transfer of aid, and then also to take back any immigrants who wanted to go back and build a new Yugoslavia, which, as we'll get into a separate episode when we talk about the immediate post-war period and then McCarthy, becomes a rather intriguing idea as they start to get persecuted by the American state. Not long after, they're enjoying the broadest level of support that they possibly could. Or that, maybe possibly that any communist-led organization has had in the U.S. I mean, they really describe by the end of the war, when they're recognized by the U.S. government, they're having giant banquets in the Waldorf Astoria. They had national radio coverage for their proclamations in support of Tito and the partisans and stuff. I mean, pretty unprecedented access to American media.
Yeah. I mean, by that time, Tito is also kind of recognized by the Yugoslav king in London as a member. Now, he's the member of the Yugoslav government. So, and the partisans are the official Yugoslav army. So,
Yeah, and of course, the Serbian National Defender and the Serbian National Federation are still towing the Chetnik line. In some OSS reports about them, they cite the fact that they believe that it was the British that sold out Draža. If it was up to the Americans, he would have their support. The whole situation would be different if the British hadn't gotten involved. And so, there's some interesting accounts of, what this looked like at the end of the war. Marković and Maletic making, and other members of the United Committee, tours around different communities where they're, reading off Tito's letter to the United Committee to, roaring applause. Right before Marković departs the country, he again goes to Little Montenegro in Hazleton, where they tell him, send our regards to Tito and bring us back the banner of the First Proletarian Brigade or something, that kind of thing. Again, to me, it's just interesting to read because it's not generally how one understands what was happening in the Yugoslav community during World War II. But of course, one thing that we mentioned a couple times was this, support for the Allied war effort, right? And what that meant concretely. Well, to some members of the South Slavic community in the U.S., it wasn't enough to, lend material support. Some wanted to go and join the partisans directly. And Marković was approached by several, Yugoslavs who wanted to go out and join the partisans, and specifically a group from Canada, which included a bunch of veterans of the Spanish Civil War who wanted to go over and fight. And he was like, look, I can't really facilitate that for you. At the very beginning of the war, Markovic had apparently, again, he had some communication directly with HQ back home, because apparently he had written to Tito and asked him if he could come, and join the partisans. He was a commander in the Spanish Civil War and all this other thing. And Tito told him, no, you should stay and organize, the emigres over there. That's how you will contribute to the cause, blah, blah, blah. And so Markovic, tells all these guys, no, you can't do it. First of all, it's not really possible. How are you going to get there? But a group from Canada manages to do that because, of course, Canada is not the U.S. And through a relationship, this is a really crazy story. I really didn't know about this before. Through British intelligence, some apparently British intelligence officers agree to transfer a group of Yugoslav Canadians to Yugoslavia undercover to go join the partisans. And they moved them out of Canada to Brazil, where they board a cargo ship bound for Europe, which gets torpedoed by a German sub.
Oh, shit.
Pretty soon after it goes out into the Atlantic. A bunch of them died, but a bunch of them survived on this shipwreck for days until they were picked up by another cargo ship and then taken back to Brazil. Some of them were like too injured to even return back to Canada. And some of them were then reportedly went back to the US and Canada. And apparently some maybe, and Markovic isn't quite clear on this, because he's refuting something that somebody else had written about it that I haven't read. And so I don't know. But that some of them did end up making it over again through British intelligence.
Oh, so those guys were highly motivated after that, really, to still want to go there.
Yeah, right. Because you survived a fucking shipwreck.
Yeah, went to Brazil, being torpedoed by Nazis, almost dying, then going back to Canada, and then going back to Yugoslavia.
Via Brazil and Cuba, and it's a wild story, and I had no idea that had happened. So yeah, I guess, and of course, the British relationship with the partisans is a lot more complex than the American one. So if you weren't able to do something like that, and most weren't, you were encouraged to join the U.S. military. And so the case of somebody like Stevan Dedier, who we mentioned briefly last week, is a good example of that.
Yes.
Dedier was one of the editors of the Free Word, had spent, already well over a decade in the U.S., involved in, the emigre left communities there, and volunteered to join the OSS, right? The OSS, of course, if you don't know, predecessor to the CIA, blah, blah, blah.
I don't know if he was a communist or a communist sympathizer.
He was a communist at the time, because he was an editor for the Free Word.
Okay.
And actually, that he had, and was involved for quite some time. He apparently helped smuggle Mustafa Golubic out of the U.S.
Interesting.
He talks about in an interview way later in the 90s. He says that he got contacted by a guy that was like, you need to go to New York. There's somebody that needs to talk to you. And it's Mustafa Golubic being like, the FBI is looking for me. I liquidated some. Anyway.
Mustafa Golubic is an enigmatic figure that for sure we'll have one episode on just to talk about him. He was everything, that guy, because he was Muslim origin, but in his youth kind of identified with Serbian nationalism and was a member of Young Bosnia, but also of the Black Hand group, and was connected heavily with them. And then he was one of the original Chetniks that existed even before the First World War, and kind of went, to guerrilla warfare in Macedonia with them. And then after the First World War became a communist and worked for, I think, the Comintern directly, but for sure for the Soviets.
Yeah, he was like an NKVD agent.
I think maybe we'll discuss that. This is disputed by some people. It's not exactly, I think, I'm not sure if he was, it's often said that, but I think he worked for the Comintern, but we'll We'll talk about that in that episode.
Either way, Dediad claims that he helped smuggle him out of the U.S., that he put him up in some like house in Ohio before he found some sailors that were able to smuggle him out. Anyway, so Dediad joins the OSS. At the time, the OSS already had a pretty well-established mission with the Chetniks as well, right? They had also Americans of Yugoslav origin, guys like George Musulin, kind of one of the more well-known guys of that type, who was OSS officer working with the Chetniks directly, later a CIA operative after World War II. But Dediad, apparently, when he signed up, they were going to send him to the Chetniks, and he said, I won't do that. So he later, he became a member of the 101st Airborne Division, was a paratrooper, and later was, part of the OSS delegation to the Yugoslav partisans, right? Yeah. His brother was a partisan, and later the official biographer of Tito. He kind of existed in these insider circles, lived in Yugoslavia after the war, had some little dissident troubles. Interesting.
Stevan Dediad left Yugoslavia, right? He came back after the war and was one of the leaders of kind of the Yugoslav nuclear energy program, and then I think left Yugoslavia. And
lived in Scandinavia. He helped to develop the idea of like business espionage or whatever.
Okay.
Kind of crazy figure. But basically, if you wanted to go join the war effort, that's how they encouraged you to do it, right? Most of them, of course, probably ended up not being Stevan Dediad, not attaining such a high position or working within the OSS, but it was definitely like encouraged to do that.
Stevan Dediad looks like a guy who would get along with people like James Angleton, for example. He's like he looks like he smokes a pipe, and he's like a very kind of distinguished looking, kind of sophisticated person, kind of American style, I would say.
Yeah, well, I mean, he spent a long time there, so
yeah,
it definitely had an effect on him. But for the very end here, I think it would be interesting just to bring up again our old friends, the De Leonists, because we have to keep it obscure. Yes. But there were elements of the South Slavic community in the U.S. and Canada at the time which were not supportive of these kind of broad anti-fascist coalitions, and were in fact quite critical of it, but from a very orthodox Marxist perspective. And I found that pretty interesting, because I went back and I was reading a lot of their issues from like between 1941 and 45. And there's some pretty interesting stuff there. So like from the get-go in 1941, they criticize the Free Word and the People's Herald for appealing to like a patriotic sensibility. And so like in one article they show parts of articles in like the two communist newspapers, and then in two like kind of more like the Serbian National Federation, the American Serbian Defender, and the Croatian Fraternal Unions newspaper, and then say, where can you can you guess which one's which? Because they're all kind of appealing to the patriotic duty of the homeland calls and are calling back to the homeland.
So they did the kind of game that we had with David Myatt and Jordan Peterson in one of our first episodes.
In their activities during the war, primarily criticizing the other Yugoslav communists on this like really orthodox basis. So
basically, there's something like left communists, no? Like in
pretty much,
position.
Yeah. Like so, once the United Committee is formed, they criticize them and they criticize the partisans for wanting to set up a federation, like a Yugoslav federation that, they argue is still capitalist. And so, communists have no business supporting either capitalist options, which is the monarchy or capitalist Yugoslavia. And they kind of go on and on more or less on that line. But what's interesting about it too is, they obviously have to address this problem constantly because I think it was constantly coming up for them. So like when the Soviet Union gets invaded, I think this was a translation of maybe the Socialist Labor Party's like official stance towards this, which is like, what should we do about, the invasion of the Soviet, what do we think about the invasion of the Soviet Union? And they, of course, say something like, it's a tremendous tragedy that, the fascists are attacking, Nazis are attacking, and we hope that the Soviet people can defeat them, but then also defeat the plutocratic tendencies of Stalinism. And then again, like because they kind of have like an op-ed section at the end, where it's kind of more their like opinion pieces where they really talk about this in detail. But, they had meetings and picnics constantly. And, I think that they had this problem of people at those picnics being like, well, shouldn't we support the partisans? Like, come on, like what's going on? And then being like, well, we understand, but, what we hope happens in Yugoslavia is that like it's a terrible tragedy what's happening there and blah blah blah, but we hope that they can unite under like that anti-capitalist banner of Marxism-Leonism, and that's pretty much the extent of it. Although I do think it's interesting. Their critiques are like they take it pretty far back. Like they criticize. Yugoslav communists for adopting, for Stalinists adopting Svetozar Marković, and they talk a lot about like early socialism in Yugoslavia and the idea of a Balkan Federation. But of course, they talk about this in the context of criticizing the main party and Stalinism in general.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I wonder if any of them like try to join the partisans and kind of spread their thought in that way. That would be
no. I think I mentioned in the first episode that we did that they said that they were sending their newspapers and stuff to Yugoslavia after the war, and that they had some contacts there. But I mean, even now, I think their support during World War II was. I think they were losing supporters at this time. I mean, they definitely had like a core base, but it's hard to get a good idea of the numbers, but like you can see something where they talk about like the amount of people that attend meetings and picnics, and it seems to be relatively small. Although at this period in time, they still have chapters all over the U.S.
Yeah.
So they were clearly, they were there. They had some sort of presence. A lot of their publications also focus on like the economic aspect. So, right, part of their party line is that like, there's nothing we can really do to help Yugoslavia from America. We have to like, agitate for whatever they call it, the industrial state or whatever.
But you never saw any mention of any group in Yugoslavia that's like aligned with them.
No, but I also didn't read too many of like the much later editions. Like I kind of focused on like 41 to 44 thereabouts. You know what I mean? Because after that, I more or less know. But I was kind of interested in what they were saying, like while it was like really uncertain what was going to happen.
Or maybe in the 30s, maybe something existed in the 30s.
Yeah, maybe. I could. I'll look into it. But yeah, of course they objected to conscription as well. They were one of the few socialist parties in the U.S. to kind of oppose the war effort. And everything that they talk about is how the war is, a war between capitalist states. When Mussolini gets overthrown, they say it's capitalists being replaced by capitalists, as I mentioned before. So that's the kind of general vibe. But that's definitely a minority. Clearly, I mean, when part of what's interesting to me about when you look at the United Committee and all these activities that are going on during the war is how large these events are, which is again something I didn't know anything about. They'd have a meeting in whatever city, thousands of people. American Slav Congress, meeting 1943, 10,000 people. You know what I mean? Like, they're really bringing out the numbers there.
Yeah.
Oh, and of course, the cross-class collaboration there was not lost on the workers' struggle people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
interesting group. I would like to know more about them. Yeah, there are like groups like that are completely kind of buried and forgotten by, well, even the Yugoslav like official, kind of Titoist historiography.
Well, clearly. I mean, they didn't
No.
they didn't support them.
No.
They called them capitalists from
Yeah. And the tactic was mostly like not to even mention these groups, that they existed even.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, in the books that these communists that were based in America wrote, they always do mention them, but that's because they did play an very important role in, like, the World War I era, pre-World War I era, up and through the 20s and whatever. But that's probably the extent of what you'll see about them.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's a pretty we got a pretty broad range of perspectives here, I think.
Yeah. Nikola Tesla, De Leonists, Louis Adamic,
fucking Dionysian.
Yes, Bishop Dionysian, Jovan Dučić, all kinds of fascists. Yeah, unfortunately, those people will be more important in the future episodes.
Right. So we'll, after this, be getting into what happened immediately after the war and into the McCarthy period. And that'll kind of round out, I think, this part of the arc. Because after that, the McCarthy area does a number on these groups.
Of course, yeah.
One of the funny things anytime you read something from this time period is like the complete how transparent all these groups were about like who was a membership. Everybody using their real names.
Yeah.
Everybody like newspapers list like even fucking De Leonis like lists who contributed how much money and their like home address and all this kind of stuff. Which when you're dealing with the McCarthy era is going to be bad news for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff.
Yeah, they were not concerned with that kind of security culture at all back then. I guess, they didn't have anything to hide. The only time they would like be very discreet about it is if they were in the U.S. illegally,
of course,
which some of them were. But otherwise, yeah, it was right about it. Get your name out there. And of course, I did skip over a lot of crazy stories, and there's a lot of other stuff. More, a whole arc could be done just on that time period and of that movement.
Well, if you think some of the crazy stories are especially interesting, we can always have some extra Patreon episode.
True that. Well, we very well might, but we've stayed on for a while here.
Yes, we shouldn't end.
Fritz gave us a deadline for when to send this,
which is now, exactly now.
Which is exactly right now. Sorry, Fritz, this is longer than you wanted it to be.
Yeah, it usually is. Yeah.
Anyway, this episode will be coming out late, but you already know this if you're listening because it will be
because it is late. Yeah.
All right, so see you at the premium episode.
Yes.
American Slav Congress. For the rest of you schlubs, will be McCarthy, I guess, next
week. Yeah.
All right. Later.
Bye.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.